introduction, and I appreciate the invitation here. It's an honor. Veronica, thank you so much. You guys don't necessarily know this, but in addition to Veronica and Marie hosting this event on behalf of the Faculty Center, Veronica also put together a playlist for me, which I really loved. The playlist, we share a similar taste in sort of, I don't know, electro pop or some sort of whatever you would call it. And what you didn't hear when Veronica thanked Sonia was that Sonia had to figure out the design for this. She had to work with a physicist on that, and you can only imagine getting design decisions from a physicist is not something you want to try to do. You know, tell me about your color palette. What? You want to talk about the frequency spectrum? So I really appreciate it because it turned out wonderfully, and thank you so much. And I also, yeah, thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. And it's so great to see so many people that I live in one place. That's really fabulous. And so the talk is about technology in the classroom, salvation or abomination. And if you doze off, I'll just tell you now the answer is it depends. Okay, so sorry that's not more definitive, but you know how it is. So before I get started, I'd like to thank a number of people, some of whom are in this room, and it's a great privilege to be able to thank them in person. Let me start by thanking Fred, who Veronica mentioned is here. He's a professor of physics at San Diego State and a physics education researcher, and has been a mentor to me since I got started in this field, and a collaborator, and just a really great leader of the projects that I will be talking about tonight. So many thanks to him. And a number of colleagues at other institutions. I'd love to tell you about all of the work I've been doing over the last however long it is, but you know, we all got to get home. So I'll try to keep it short, but also to acknowledge Chuck, who's been involved in many of the crazy projects over the years. And Stephen also has gotten into a few of them. He doesn't know how to say no, but we're working on that. Really, the whole department is very supportive of this work, and that means a lot. The other folks who I'd like to acknowledge are some of the undergrads who've been involved in this, and there's a number of them listed on this slide as well, so thank you to them. The NSF has funded some of this, and I'd really be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the role that IITS has had in this work, because they've been a huge supporter of it, a huge enabler of it. And I couldn't have done it without them. And I think the relationship we have with them on this campus and their mission to support instruction is really something special that is not in place on every campus. And so I really value that, and I thank them for all the support. Also, Deanna, thank you very much for being here and for listening to so many physics lectures at the dinner table. You can only imagine. And Deanna is a neuroscientist. So think about that. You've got a physicist and a neuroscientist. You know, it almost sounds like a sitcom. Right? Of course, that's just a joke. I'm not a particle physicist. So, you know, to come and hear a talk by a physicist, you may be expecting this, right? This set of equations, or maybe this. You know, this is at the Large Hadron Collider. But the context for my work is more like that picture in the upper right in the classroom. So I work on physics education, and this is an effort that has taken shape in physics over the last 10, 20 years for people in physics departments who consider themselves to be physicists to work on education. And this is an effort which also includes other science and math and engineering disciplines under the sort of umbrella term of discipline-based education research. And if you are sick of hearing about STEM and STEM education, I'm sorry, but people do want to talk about it a lot these days, and the work that the physics community has done in physics education research has been really valuable, I think, and positioned us to address many of the challenges that we face currently in STEM education. Just to give you a kind of a capsule summary of the field, I describe it as scientific inquiry into how people learn the concepts, the practices, the ways of thinking of science and engineering and math. All right, what is the nature and the process of development of expertise in those disciplines. So we want students to begin as novices and grow into experts. And how does that take place? And how can you foster that? And how can you make education in these disciplines broadly inclusive? And so one of the things that's been great about being in this field within physics is that there's been tremendous support for it. The American Physical Society, which is our professional society, endorsed this effort as early as 1999, and that I think has been very visionary and allowed physics education to have a leadership role within the discipline-based education research community. There are programs in this area all over the US, and there are some very prominent dots down there in the lower left corner. San Diego State is represented, and Fred's group there has been prominent for many years. But also our campus is prominent, and not just the work that I'm doing. In fact, maybe not even the work that I'm doing is the most important thing. Go all the way back in history to the founding of our department. Now, you know him as the provost, but Graham, when he came here as a physicist to start the department, came from the University of Washington, one of the leading institutions in physics education research, and he was a real leader in that as well, and actually in the area of technology and using computer-based systems to help people learn. So that was the foundation for our department, and that continued with Chuck, who is also very heavily involved in curriculum development, some really innovative stuff at UC Davis. He is co-author on a forthcoming volume from the National Academies of Science, which is a pretty big deal if you know about the National Academies. So we have a department here that's been heavily engaged in this work, and it's been an exciting place to be doing it. So that's kind of the context. So you're not going to get a lot of physics and particles. So you're going to get more about education. And I hope to, I hope that there's something for all of you in there. And I'm going to start with 2 examples of my work, and then at the end kind of open it up to see how that framework can help us understand maybe some of the other issues we face in education, and then everybody can jump in. That would be great. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. My work is in this area is in the context of thinking about tools, and I'll use that word tools broadly, not just to mean technology like your phone and your computer, technology, but also any sort of tool that you use to interact with the environment, any sort of artifact, and how do those affect what is possible, and particularly what's possible in the context of a classroom. Right? With different tools, we can do different things. Can we use them to facilitate learning? Can we use them to restructure the classroom? And I'll give you some examples of that. And if we can understand how tools can take on these roles, can we use that to design effective learning environments, right? More effective curricula and even better tools in an iterative way. So the 2 examples will be, the first one will be on this sort of smaller scale of single students or groups of students, and they'll be working with hands-on manipulables or simulations, or maybe watching videos of experiments. And then I'm going to talk about another example on a larger scale that is across an entire classroom and using a web-based system that involves students writing and then also, grading each other's work, evaluating each other in the classroom without total chaos ensuing. And so to begin with, let me talk a little bit about tools in a broad sense. So some concepts that'll be useful in thinking about tools. Let me begin by example. So how do you get through this door? It's not a trick question. What do? You approach this door. What do? You pull it? Okay, yeah. It looks like a pull, like a handle, right? You pull it. What do you do at this door? Which side? How about this door? Which side? So it's clear with that door, you don't really have any way to pull it, and it's clear, it conveys to you clearly you should push it on the right side, whereas the other one's ambiguous. And the one on the left, you could actually push or pull, and it's fun to watch people in those situations, go to a conference and camp out. So one last example of doors. This is from Lourdes over on Escondido Boulevard, and so it's got the push bar, but it says push, but then it says pull really loudly. The funny thing is, the door swings both ways. You can do whatever you want. I mean, so this is sort of as a humor, but also to say something which is that design, first of all, one of the things that design does and tools do is they carry suggestions about their use. And that comes because they're designed with intentionality and they convey that to us. But also, putting a label or instructions on top of something is very weak in comparison to the underlying design. Right? So that suggestion to pull, no one pays attention to that. Everyone pushes on the bar. And so some words to go along with some of these ideas I've been talking about is the idea of affordances, the sort of natural use that an object suggests for itself. And then constraints also. Naturally there are some things you can't do with some objects. Right? If the bar has no way to pull on it or no easy way to pull on it, you're not going to. And a lot of times we think of constraints as a bad thing, but often they can be productive, and I'll show you examples of that. And so carefully designing constraints into a system can be a very important part of design. The tools shape what we can do, and they enable new possibilities, but in a non-deterministic way. And a nice word to capture all of this is that tools have a mediating role. And so they mediate our interactions with things, with each other, and with the environment. Who's familiar with clickers? Yeah, great, most of you. If I had clickers, I could have asked you about that. Clickers, but so, clickers and flashcards, this is something Chuck and I have worked on some, and it's an interesting kind of thing to compare them. So the idea of both of these, okay, they're two tools, right? One is technology, the other one's paper. That's a technology also, but we don't usually think of it as sort of fancy technology. But both of those are tools. They allow us to do things like collect feedback from our class in a rapid way. But they also have some different features, right? With the clicker, I get this record. I can show the quantitative graph. With the flashcards, it's more of a kind of an overall feel. It's not as quantitative. The level of privacy of your response is different between the two things, and that may make a difference for how students are willing to engage with this. And it's interesting because the flashcards are clearly more public, but the clicker thing it's private, but not anonymous. I have a record of every student's response, and I can go back and use that to assign them credit or to investigate the patterns or whatever. And I can also save this record to discuss with a colleague or look for changes over time. So it offers some interesting things, but of course it also comes with some overhead as well with the cost of the device, and that is something to keep in mind. The constraints here, you have a limited set of answers that you can give with either of these, right? That's the constraint among them. So that's just to illustrate some of these ideas about tools. And I want to now give you an example to illustrate some of the mediating functions that tools can play and how that can shape the sorts of things that happen as students engage with content and with process. So I'm going to talk about this context. This is work that, as I mentioned, Fred has led this collaboration with myself and a number of other colleagues at other institutions. And this work goes back really over a decade in the past to the development of a curriculum primarily for pre-service elementary teachers. It's a conceptual physics course, originally designed to be taught in a lab environment. So like on the left there, a small class where you can have a lot of students working in groups, working on experiments, having discussions with the whole class, lots of time. And then it became clear that it was valuable to have a version of this that could be taught in a class like the lecture format. And there you have a lot of other constraints. You don't have the space, you probably don't have as much time. The groups may be more difficult. And so we had to, there were a lot of challenges in this and a lot of opportunities to use technology in order to make this adaptation. And there's a whole story about that, and I would say largely this has been successful and is actually now, there are many versions of this, and then there's been another generation of them, literally a next generation of the curricula that has been brought into alignment with the next generation science standards, and there's a lot to say about that, but ask me later. This is what it looks like. Students in a big classroom, maybe 100 students, in groups. They have They have clickers, so you can have small group discussions here, but it's hard to have a whole class discussion that's got a lot of students engaged in it. But you can have clicker voting or polling as a proxy for that kind of a whole class discussion. They also have a workbook on the table, and again, this is the sort of thing you don't necessarily think of as technology, but it is a tool that helps structure what happens in the class, and you'll see places where that's important. So as I mentioned, this is a conceptual course in physics. The topics in the content include magnetism, energy, force, but then also practices are an important part of this. And these are practices that come out of the next generation science standards, which is the standards for K-12, but also have a lot of important overlap with what we want students to learn about science at any level. And the practices include asking questions, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing. Okay, so this is a long list of them, and this curriculum engages students in almost all of those, really. Maybe the first one is something that they don't ask. Well, you'll see places where they do ask their own questions in some respects. So I'm going to now, within this context, tell you a little bit about students' use of experimentation with physical objects, simulations, so experimenting in simulated environments, and just watching videos of phenomena. So in this environment, there are some experiments the students cannot do just practically, and so we made videos of those. We show those videos in the class. And some experiments they could do on their desks, and so that might look like this, where the students have a little bit of equipment here. They have a flashlight. They have a flashlight and a lens and a screen, and they're looking at the image formation there. And then also they can work with a simulation on the computer. And so what I'd like to do is to show you how the students work in these different environments is different and how it's affected by the tools that they're using. And so to set the stage for this, I'm going to show you some video of these students, and it's very rich. You can see what's going on and see the discussions they're having. And I want to just focus you on a couple of these right now: developing and using models, and planning and carrying out investigations, and analyzing and interpreting data. And particularly, don't think of data necessarily as numerical data, but it's just observations in general. So I want you to see how students are doing that as they work through this. So here's what the prompt, they're told basically, don't read all this, they're told to set this thing up and set it up like this, and they're asked a couple different questions, but then one question they're eventually asked is, when you raise the light source, what happens to the image on the screen? Okay, so for reasons much like the reasons we make videos in those courses, I made a video to show you what happens because I didn't want to bring it all down here. Okay, so here's what happens. I could ask you to predict what happens, but this isn't physics class, so just watch. So you see there's a spot on the screen, and now I'm going to raise the light source and watch the spot. So what does the spot do? Right, I raise the light source and the spot goes down. You all answered exactly the way we intended for you to answer. No, I mean that in all sincerity. And you'll see that that's not a foregone conclusion. So now I'm going to show you some video of these students doing this. Okay, and I hope you'll be able to hear this pretty well. You can see the setup they've got here, and they're grappling with that question.
One team member should hold the screen at the position of the image point. Another team member should shift the mag light can slowly upwards.
So I just hold it?
Yeah, and go slowly upwards.
Hold on to this just a little. Oh, it's like, do you see how?
Oh, it's like cutting it off. It's getting smaller and smaller on the bottom. Wow. When you raise a light.
Okay, so what happened? They did it, yeah, they did it wrong, right? I mean, first off, they did the experiment wrong. But what does wrong mean in this context? Right? So what wrong really means is, and what we should really say is, they didn't do what we intended. I mean, they're working with the physical apparatus. What they saw is real. Okay, that's the real behavior of this optic phenomena, but it wasn't what we intended for them to do. But now remember, I asked you to think about their engagement with these practices of carrying out investigation, analyzing and interpreting data or observations. Okay, so think about how those processes are playing out here.
Towards what happens to the image on the screen.
It
gets cut off.
Like a baby.
You said it looks like a baby.
Like it gets cut off. There you
They're
go.
flapping.
Yeah.
So how do we say
It goes
that?
from a circle to
To a semicircle?
well, that's like a half circle.
Half moon?
But look at it. It starts getting like, and then it starts going like outward like a triangle.
Oh, you're so smart. Okay. So how do we want to describe it?
Elongated
Triangular thing.
So they worked for a while at trying to describe what they were seeing, and what I would say here is that they were really engaged. They were engaged in exploring this phenomena. They were systematic about it. They repeated it to see, and trying to really give a apt description of what they saw. Those are all things we want them to be doing. And one of the things, maybe I should let it play just a little bit longer here, sorry. So they had talked for a while about how to describe this. They kind of decided what to write down, and they started to write that down. And then they actually wanted to look at it again.
So there it's like a crescent. And then what?
It gets like it's getting sucked.
See it?
Yeah. I see the triangle.
Okay, so they actually at the end went back and rechecked it, and that's interesting because when I showed you that video, if we had showed them a video in class, there would have been no opportunity to do that. Right? So when you think about how the different tools that they're able to use here let them do different things, with this they can explore their own questions. Right? They can check and recheck. They can try on descriptions for phenomena and then compare again to what they saw. And notice also how they are engaged, right? Some of them are directly using the apparatus. Others are, one of them sort of reading and kind of directing people, but then everybody else is involved in this sort of checking processes. And did you get that? And they're working together on this. Now, there's a lot going on there. One of the things I should say is I don't want you to come away with the idea that these experiments always sort of fail in that sense. Most of the time, like 75% of the time when students do them, they do them as we intended. And we also institute a process of asking them with the clicker to share their results with the class at the end. And so we'll see a consensus of, 75, 80% of the class observe this, and that's a great example of how science works, right? You often, there's reasons why your experiment might not have given you the same result as everybody else, but in general, we go with the consensus that we agree on. So, okay, now, what happened next was, and this is a little bit artificial because this group is being filmed for these purposes, but the person operating the camera, he intervened, okay? Yeah, exactly. So, okay.
Okay.
This more?
I can't tilt it.
Oh, lift it.
Wait. Whoa.
Kind of. See, it gets.
doing it wrong. Are we doing it wrong?
So it gets.
kind of looks the same.
Yeah, it just gets super pointy. Watch. So again.
But look at the light behind it.
There's like two lights.
Oh, you can see two circles.
Well, I guess we're focusing on the obvious, but
Go again. It's like metamorphosis.
so that moves down and then they like.
It separates and forms a new circle.
Okay.
So what they ended up saying was it separates and forms a new circle. So notice the basic phenomena that you all observed, that moving down, that was there, but there was a lot of other stuff going on, and they were engaged in trying to understand that. And real phenomena are rich. And the only reason in physics we've made any progress is because we simplify things down. But that's a process that requires that's not an automatic thing, right? There's processing and decision-making in doing that. And that's one of the hallmarks of expertise in physics, is that you understand that process of idealization, but it is a learned thing. It is not a thing that we automatically know to do. And so seeing students grapple with that, I think in some ways is a sign that they're engaged with this process, even though it feels inefficient, right? It's like, no, things just moves down, that's it. That's all. Leave it there. So phenomena are rich, and you can now see a comparison when you look at how this is captured in this simulation. So this is a simulation. This is from the PhET site out of Colorado. Loads of great simulations. And so we have a point source. First of all, well, let me just play for you. Here's how it goes. Oh, oops. I grabbed the wrong thing. Okay, so you see the dot on the screen? Okay, so the simulation can capture that same result. Notice there's no way for me, it can also show you this, there's no way for me to tilt, right? That's not a feature. That's a productive constraint in the simulation. Now watch this. Okay. So simulations can reveal to us, or at least visualize for us, things that are not visible in the world. And they can help us with a mechanistic explanation. Okay, so again, in the simulation, certain things are not allowed, and that is, in a way, a productive constraint. Also notice that the full complexity of the phenomena is a little bit reduced. This is it's realistic, but it's a little bit of an idealization also, and that is another feature of the simulation. Okay, so now let's watch the students engage with this. And this clip goes on for a couple minutes, but there's a lot happening.
Place the screen at the image point.
Okay, so they're setting up.
Drag the light source upwards, then downwards, and describe what happens.
As it goes up, rays go downward and then.
So did you catch what she said right there? She basically said, as you raise the light source, the rays go down and the image goes down. Okay, so that if you're thinking of this in terms of trying to get the right answer, that's sort of the answer we were hoping, or the thing we hoped they would observe. But watch how their conversation goes from there.
As you go up, that
It changes the image point.
What gets bigger?
look at the little circle, the image point.
So did you notice when I showed you the movie of the simulation, as you move it closer and further, the image on the screen gets bigger, and they're noticing that that's happening right now. But they're not supposed to be moving it forwards and backwards. They're supposed to be going up and down, but that's not a constraint in the simulation. You can move it all over, and that's what's happening. And they discovered this, they figured that out after a little bit of discussion.
It gets bigger? Oh, it does get bigger. Or smaller. Because it loses rays, no?
Maybe it's just the angle of this.
Because it always has 4, if you notice.
Yeah. No.
And at one time there's a 3.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just crazy. What were you saying, Lacey? I was just saying as it goes up, the image point goes down, and as it goes down, it goes up.
Well, that got bigger. Maybe.
So you notice the student in the front left was just kind of sitting there waiting, and then eventually they came back to her point, and she made it again. But then when they went back to look at the simulation, they got engaged again with this issue of how the point is moving, and so they're still not quite ready to hear what she had to say.
You're moving it closer without knowing.
Now that she recognized what's going on, you're moving it closer without knowing. So they've had the opportunity to explore this and figure out some of the
How does that
complexity.
explain the 2 circles that we saw?
Okay, so the simulation doesn't capture that part of it. But they're trying to reconcile what they saw with what they're seeing simulated.
Just to explain the 2 circles we saw?
No, it's saying,
Oh, okay.
describe what happens to the image point on the screen as you move it upwards and downwards.
It goes opposite.
Okay, so she got they redirected back to the
That
workbook.
moves opposite of
The image
light
point.
source. Yeah.
So they said, what are we being asked here? They went back to the workbook, which simply said, what happens when you move the light source up? Oh, it goes down. And that's what they wrote down. So they spent a lot of time investigating this, and eventually they did write down the things which we had hoped they would write down, but they spent a lot of time exploring it along the way to come to that understanding. I'll say a little more about that in a second. But let me just also mention the video. So we often would use a video. So here's a video of some motion, right? These are hard for them to do because they require this large track you can see in the screenshot. And so what ends up happening is all the students just watch. So this is very different when you think about who's involved and what they're doing and what their experience is, right? It's all controlled by the instructor who plays the video and only can play what's already recorded, really. Now, you can do some cool things with video, and we have, right? Like show two things side by side, or use slow-mo, or things like that. So it does give you some impressive features, but it also doesn't allow the students this kind of freedom to explore. On the other hand, when we make the video, you do enough takes so that it's unambiguous. None of you had a problem getting the intended answer from that video I showed you at the very beginning, because I set it up so that it would be totally clear. And I didn't move the thing far enough to get that weird phenomenon that they got distracted by. Okay, so when you, so this is sort of a comparison between these different modes. And so what I would say is that should you choose one or the other? It depends. It depends on what you're after. If you want students to be engaged with these phenomena and think about them, explore them, ask and answer their own questions in these phenomena, and develop their own skills about judgment and interpreting and idealizing what to ignore and what's important, then you need to let them play with the stuff, right? Either in a hands-on environment or in a simulated environment. And in actuality, the interplay of the two can be very rich. And I think you saw how that can come out. The simulation can support the real physical objects. The videos are so efficient. Right? You can show the video and you're just done. And everybody sees right away. And the students get that too. We've asked them about this and surveyed them, and they express a comfort level with the results from the videos because they know we've made them unambiguous. Right? But again, this goes to the social construction of the classroom. They're in a class and they know that somebody's designed this class with a particular goal in mind. They're very cognizant of that. And they want to make sure they get to that point. Eventually they know they'll be tested on it, right? So that ambiguity with the more open environments can be a problem for the students if they don't feel like they reach closure. Ultimately, how you choose, the other thing about the videos to be said, though, is they still give you evidence. It's not me saying this is what happens or this is the way the world works. It's actually observing, at least indirectly, how the world works. So if you just want to give them evidence for physical phenomena, that's a way to do it very quickly, and that's powerful. Yeah. Okay, so I want to change gears a little bit and quickly describe some of the work with this web system for students to write scientific explanations in a big class. So some of these other practices that I didn't talk about yet were constructing explanations, engaging in argument from evidence, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And one of the things, if you want students to evaluate things, that is a challenge, right? That is a role that is not necessarily most people's view of what a student role is. The student is to learn. The instructor is the one who should know everything and evaluate. So we're seeking to upset or disrupt the roles in the classroom. And it's a challenge. It can be a challenge to do that. You can get a lot of pushback if you try to do that. We've used a system called calibrated peer review, which supports students' construction and evaluation of explanations. And there's feedback. There's a lot of structure to it. There's a limited grading load for the instructor. This is another kind of change in the roles in the class. I know now you can't wait to hear more, right? So there's 3 phases. Each has its own sort of timeline and deadline. Text entry, you come in, you're a student, you log in, here's a prompt. Tell me about this. Okay, I write that's my answer. Great. You come back the next day, the calibration stage. I show you 3 sample responses to that prompt, and then you practice grading them, basically. Now, those were prepared by us, so we know how they should be graded, and we can give you that feedback. So you're calibrating the way you evaluate to the way the developers did. You take that and understanding, and then you start grading your peers. This is all anonymous, and the computer handles all the shuffling of the paper, which is wonderful. So here's an example. This is where students, this alignment model of magnetism, something that's developed in the course, and the students use that at the end of that material to explain a nail being magnetized first by a magnet, and then demagnetized after you hit it with it. If you just wail on it, it'll stop being a magnet. And the students are asked to explain that. And they're asked in a very sort of specific way, like in your first paragraph, explain how the nail gets magnetized. Draw a diagram showing the unmagnetized and magnetized state. In your second paragraph, explain, and so it's very prescribed. Here's an example result from a student. Okay, so you see the drawing, you can read what they wrote, but you don't really need to read what they wrote. That's okay. The next thing that happens, so they put this into the system. The next thing that happens is they get these evaluation questions. Here's an example of one. And you can see this is very specific. Does the first paragraph correctly describe this? Blah, blah, blah. And so they get these sample essays that we wrote, and they use these evaluation questions. And there are 10 questions, and they take the number of yeses, and that's the overall score. So some of the essays are really good, some are lousy, and the students then see the feedback. This is how you should have scored it. This is how you did score it. Then, after that stage, they get to grade each other's work. They grade 3 people's work, and they get an average score from that. So the first question you might have about this, if it made any sense at all, and it is complicated. But the first question is, well, do they grade each other the way you would? Right? So we went in by hand and graded several hundred samples of these students' work, using the same evaluation questions they'd used with each other. And the result was that the expert grading was the same as the peer grading. And when I say the same, I mean they were statistically equivalent. And I could show you a bunch of data, but that's... The other thing we did was we put an item on the final exam. And we also put this in another series of courses that covered the similar content but did not include these activities. And the students who did these CPR activities outperformed those students in a statistically significant way. Oh, okay, I can't resist showing you the data. This shows you that the students in the two courses, two sets of courses, because there was more than one course, they were the same on a conceptual test. So this suggests that they learned about the same amount in the course. That's what that says. Okay. But when we looked at the written explanation part of the final, the students who did not use CPR, they scored a little less than 2 overall, and the ones who did use it scored 2 3/4. So that was a significant difference. So I mentioned this had a lot to do with restructuring the roles in the classroom, and what it does is it takes the instructor out of the role of grader and evaluator, but it puts the instructor into the developer role. You have this very sophisticated assignment you have to develop with a lot of different pieces that all have to fit together. But then you don't have to grade this stuff because the students are grading each other. But the students are grading each other. And so you have to support that in a way that is meaningful, or else it's not going to work, right? That could easily fall apart because you're asking for something quite big there. But the way that this task is structured and the way that this system does it is something you could never really imagine doing with paper, right? I mean, it would be very hard to implement this with paper. You're really relying on this tool to do it for you, but it does allow you to do this fairly, kind of radical thing in the classroom. So one of the things that we found was essential for doing that was having the prompts be very specific and the evaluation questions be very specific, and that was I think one of the keys to getting these peer scores equivalent. So that's all I want to say about that. I want to now zoom out a little bit and maybe start with a historical perspective, because I'd like to tie this work to some of the current issues we face with education and technology. So I'd like to take a sort of a long view, on this scale of like the 5,000-year long view, to this example of a classroom archaeologically exhumed. And it's interesting to reflect back, because then you realize how far we've come. Now that's not really fair, because classrooms are built a long time ago, and it's really in the last I don't know, 25, 10 years that we have, ubiquitous internet and now wireless and devices and the web. And so you might expect that things are changing and could change in fundamental ways now. Here's a statement about technology. I believe the blank is destined to revolutionize our educational system, and that in a few years it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. The education of the future, as I see it, will be conducted through where it should be possible to obtain 100% efficiency. Okay. Sebastian Thrum, or the edX people, or the Coursera folks. You're close. This is Edison. Okay, the motion picture, folks. So, this is not to make fun of Edison, who obviously accomplished a lot, but to say that it's not obvious that technologies will really change the core practices of education. And I think that thinking about trying to understand where this went wrong is important. Because it may be that the internet is different in a fundamental way from the motion picture and will change things, but you shouldn't start ahistorically with that claim. You should articulate how it's different than what happened here, and what happened with radio, and what happened with TV, and what happened with the personal computer. Okay? And if you want to read about that, actually, this brief book by Larry Cuban is really excellent, actually, and thought-provoking. So what I think is worth keeping in mind as you try to be Edison and predict what's going to happen with the next thing, or even on smaller scales, I want to try this in my class, is to keep in mind these other aspects of what happens in a course. Right? There are these affordances, these constraints that the tools have. They're going to restructure the activities, and there's a social element to all of it. And if you ignore the norms in your classroom and the roles that people have, and the way that the technology changes those, you will possibly blow it, it won't work out, or you may get some things that you didn't expect and you won't be able to understand them. And sometimes good things, we've seen that often, but not always. So, the news is full of things like this. This is from a few years ago. MOOCs kind of have come and gone, but some institutions like our neighbors to the east have made a core part of their practice, online instruction. And it is not to say that online instruction is something we shouldn't do. If you remember, the answer to the question was it depends, right? It's not an abomination, nor is it a salvation. The answer is that it depends. Content obviously is hugely available in ways it's never been before, and that's something we have to take into account. Will computers fix education? Is that the fix we want? Right? And what do we mean by learning? At what level on this list can we achieve with students muted from each other and isolated and interacting with the machine? So I think that when you think about salvation or abomination, it's worth thinking about explicitly your model for education. And I would propose that many people who talk about, especially MOOCs and online education, but also many people who talk about face-to-face education, talk about delivery and transmission. All right, and here's Bill Watterson captures it nicely. The problem with this is we have a lot of evidence that this doesn't work. I mean, this isn't how people learn. It's not consistent with the evidence we have. So we don't tell people how to be physicists, but we want them to become physicists, right? We want them to walk, talk, and squawk like physicists. And so what we want is, or what we have in education is not a delivery, but a transformation. Right? And we have a social process and a cultural process. That's what education is fundamentally. And if you want your students to become physicists, you need to engage them in the culture of physics. Right? So when you think about technology and education, this is courtesy of my friend Noah Finkelstein, who's at Colorado, you have to keep in mind education as a social act, right? So the thing about technology is that it can reorganize social processes, okay? And that can be really powerful. So as you think about things like MOOCs and online courses and the whole future of education, here are some questions. What are the implicit or explicit theories of learning? And are they consistent with our research on learning? So we don't have to speculate. We should look at data about how people learn. In the sciences, we have much of this. What are the roles of faculty, instructional developers, teachers, and students? How are those roles constructed, and how does the technology affect the roles that they have? And implicit or explicit views about the purposes and the mechanisms of education that are built into these structures and into these tools. And finally, and maybe specifically following that, how does technology support education as a social and cultural activity? So to leave you with two thoughts, really. The classroom is a community, and learning is a social process. And the technology we use there can support and structure interactions in productive ways. And how we choose to do that should depend on our pedagogical goals. And if we attend to how the tools can reorganize activities, roles of the participants, and the norms in that classroom, we can better understand the impact of the tools, and we can begin to design more effective environments. So thank you very much.